I think you ought to lead in with that. This crazy, weird ass episode.
Welcome everybody to this crazy, weird ass episode of the Hope Axis. I was just explaining to my friend Jim O'Shaughnessy here the sacred structure of this show, where we get smart, interesting, wonderful humans with very interesting areas of expertise here on camera, on the microphone. And we try to investigate what makes them wake up in the morning, basically, in an era where, we denounce hope in every form whatsoever every day. And yet there are incredible people and very normal people also that you've never heard of who wake up every morning and go and do their jobs. And that fascinates me. I'm always super interested in what drives the people, what hope drives the people who get exceptional things done, because I feel that they are the ones who also give other people hope. So they are kind of super hubs of hope, and we need to understand what makes them tick. That said, Jim and I just decided that this is going to be a weird ass episode of the Hope Axis. So we're not going to do the sacred structure. If it happens by accident, great. We will not throw it out, but we're not going to kind of go structurally at that arc. Jim O'Shaughnessy is my friend, an investor in Interintellect as well. I'm on his advisory board. You're famously running OSV, O'Shaughnessy Ventures, and the related fellowship program, which funds, supports incredible and kind of out of the box, weird ass humans around the world to invent the future. Beforehand, you were the head of OSAM, and we actually have a little anecdote about that, of what happened with an Interintellect salon because of OSAM. And if we get drunk enough, during this show, it's 11 a.m., so probably not, then we might tell you guys, right? Jim, welcome to the show. We will talk about your 40-plus year financial career, your journals, the books you wrote, and the books that you have just published, and Two Thoughts, which is becoming a huge success. Welcome to the Hope Axis. And how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great and better because I'm talking to you, Anna. You always brighten my day.
Thank you so much. I mean, you're sitting in this gorgeous snowy landscape. We were just discussing that thanks to the tectonic shifts, America ended up with you. Minnesota was not part of the Soviet Union. I personally think that you would have been wasted on the Soviets. You would be a strange oligarch with a strange wife, keeping, pet tigers at home on your own money, and get flinching every time the phone rings.
Or first up against the wall. That would be another option.
Yeah, you would not have known how to shut up at 20. Yeah, we would definitely not be having this conversation. But in any case, it would be a very, very different world. And I think liberal democracy is very happy to have won you. But I want to go back to Minnesota and basically find out, how did Jim O'Shaughnessy start? What happened? Did you always want to become a guest?
Should we go back to the very beginning? So what happened was my parents had martinis one night, and I resulted 9 months later. I am the youngest in my family by nearly 7 years. So I grew up as the martini child with all of my siblings. It was funny because, like, I was at once an only child because all my sisters were away at college. But then during holidays, I had all these new bosses, all women, telling me exactly what I had to do for them. And so it was a great place to be. And, being the sixth child, my parents were just tired, right? Like, there's a great story about the British lord who, before he got married, he said, I have 6 theories about how to raise children. And then he had 6 children. And when asked, he said, I now have no theories, but I do have 6 children.
Was this experience of matriarchy that made you decide to go to Wall Street in the 80s, where there are much fewer women, or that
Yeah,
was completely unrelated?
pure rebellion, pure rebellion.
Gotta show it to them. I remember we had a conversation once. We have this crazy WhatsApp group with all these amazing intellectuals, and I once there asked you, about the Wolf of Wall Street, because you were on Wall Street in the 80s, at the beginning of your career. and your first successes. And I was like, oh, Jim, was it like that? Like you have all these memories from the movie that are very funny. And you said, no, 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 because I had 3 kids in my early 20s. So you were kind of a front row observer, which I think is a deeper experience. I think if you live through an era of excess, and we will see what's going on with today, right? Like the people who are in the middle of it today, will they have a fair assessment of what's happening in government, technology, business today? Probably not. But you had this little removal, right? You were not directly staring into the sun. How was that? How was it arriving to Wall Street? And what was the world like back then?
Wow. So the world was very, very different. Everything was done in, well, let me tell you how long it took me to form my first company, which I formed when I was 27, 1987. And it took me more than 7 months to actually get that company incorporated. Why? Because you had to do everything in person. You literally had to show up at the office if you wanted to be a registered investment advisor. You didn't mail anything in, you didn't do anything online. You went there and they sat and they fired questions at you and you answered them. And then they had their little stamp and they approved the application.
And you had
But
to mail things, right? Like there was a
oh,
session. I remember
absolutely.
my childhood. It had to be an
Yeah.
envelope that can be eminently lost.
Yes,
That was the
absolutely.
point. Like, how can we lose things?
Exactly. As the good Vogons they were, the bureaucracy was like really in fine fettle because they could lose everything. And like, oh yeah, no, we didn't get your paperwork, but I handed it to you when I was with you. No, no, you didn't do that. And like literally everything just took a lot of time. And so when I got into the world of Wall Street, it was literally a different era in that the my approach to investing, which is algorithmic, evidence-based investing, right, was pretty new. And like trying to describe it to people who'd been on Wall Street for a long time was like they'd be looking at you like you had 3 heads. And it was like,
Because they were
wait,
the instinctive kinds, right? It was something that you would
absolutely.
learn, that you would build intuition based on memory.
Absolutely. And, that was what got me started being interested. I kind of viewed Wall Street as the ultimate puzzle and as the Olympics of business, right? Because it had so many threads. There were so many things going into why is that stock priced at this particular price at this particular moment? And back then, most of the people would talk about personalities, right? Like, so and so is a great CEO, or, I was golfing with him and he told me this, this, and this. And I thought that that was a subpar way of looking at making investments.
That's very interesting. It's like in
So,
the Aristotelian structure, it's lower, right? Because you have ethos, pathos, logos, and it's
mhm.
stuck on the ethos level, which is kind of a medieval archetypal morality play. He is virtue and he is prudence, and like that's not how life works, right? That's not the Gestalt.
Exactly. But, one part of that actually was good at that time, and we lost it, and I hope we can get it back. And that was most people don't, and many people laugh when I tell them this, but Wall Street, even today, is based mostly on honoring your word and trust. Because if you're making 100 transactions over a telephone and you say, yep, I'll buy it at that price, and then later you say, I never said that, that's called on Wall Street getting DK'd, don't know. And
Ooh,
back
that's
then,
really good. Oh, so it's a
and
reputation business, and that hasn't
and and
changed.
and and back then, if you DK'd somebody, you were out. Literally, I don't know if there was a list where they kept everyone's names, but like if you DK'd somebody and people found out, they would not be a counterparty with you in trading. And so it was also a period. Look at all the old line financial investment banks, et cetera. What are they? They're people's names. When you put your name on a company, and it's one of the reasons I do it with my companies, is you are really, it's not, you don't just have skin in the game, you have soul, you have your character in the game. And one of the things that was very prevalent then was there were consequences to your actions, right? So think about the savings and loan crisis in 1989. So George Bush Sr. was president. The government came in and found like it was a big crisis. But here's the difference between then and, say, the financial crisis of 2008. Then lots of people went to jail. There were consequences. And in other words, nope, you fucked up, you're going to jail. And that made sense to me, right? Action over here, fuck around, find out. And it was enforced. And one of the first things that I said when I was seeing what was happening after the '08 crisis was, I am getting nervous. And they were like, why? And I went, nobody's going to jail. If nobody's going to jail, you're removing consequences. And I'm a huge believer in free markets, but free, fair markets. You can't take all of the profits for yourself and socialize your losses. And that's exactly what happened then. And when you do that, you start seeing trust in these institutions break down. And so I'm 100% in favor of that coming back to Wall Street.
It's almost like a social contract was missing, right? Or went
Yes,
missing at some point in the
exactly.
or people
And
realized that what they had thought was the social contract was no longer there because the system got stress tested and nothing happened to most people.
and that's the bigger point. The bigger point is most people notice. You might think, oh, nobody's going to notice. Nobody's going to see that we're now socializing all these losses. That's insane. People notice, and it really shakes their confidence in the underlying institution. And if that happens enough, you get where we are today. Like the loss of trust in a variety of institutions is literally a result of letting that repeat, repeat, repeat. And so coming back to just having consequences as a result of actions you take would be a big step forward, or back to the old way, as it were.
I really love Tiago Forte has this really good tweet that I often think about, which is that the best way to build a reputation is just say what you will do and then do it.
Bingo.
And you would be surprised how few people actually do what they say they will do, right?
Yeah, it's that great Jung quote, right? You are not what you say you will do, you are what you do. And I've always sort of lived my life that way. And, I fucked up a lot of things in various companies that I started, but what I tried to do was learn from all of those mistakes and, incrementally adjust and get better. And one of the things that was really important to me was that my word was my bond. And, that seems old-fashioned, but when your word is your bond, people ultimately understand that, right? They're not going to get it on their first interaction with you. Many won't even get it on their 10th interaction with you. But the fact is, you get it. And if you live your life that way, it just becomes a lot easier. And, you've got to do it when you don't want to do it. Like I was in many situations where, given the word on a particular transaction, the counterparty was not keeping up with what they said they would do. But I'm like, okay, so am I going to, in this particular instance, decide that I'm not going to honor my word? It's kind of you just got to do it consistently, because the minute you make that one exception, right? And like, well, no, fuck this. This time around, I'm not going to honor what I said. Boom. It's like an elevator down.
That's so interesting. I mean, I last year I got obsessed with this theory that I have about untested reciprocity because I'm originally Hungarian. I lived there for a very long time. And then more than 10 years ago, I left. And in between the US, where I live now, and Budapest, where I lived in my youth, I lived in London and Brussels. London for almost 7 years, Brussels around 3 years. And like London and Brussels are not favor cultures, which was very alien to me. And I really felt that it's so kind of antibody to me that I didn't even know how to deal with it. And then you realize like it's not actually an anti-favor culture. It's that their favors are locked in old aristocratic class systems and educational systems. And so you just can't get into it. Right? It exists, but it doesn't let you in. But it was really interesting for me to see the differences between the Hungarian favor system and the American one. And then as you start the conversation, you hear from people from like how it works in India or how it works in, say, Southern America. Like every culture has its own way of doing favors. And like in the Hungarian culture, because it's a small place, everybody knows everybody, word travels super fast. People use even Tinder and these apps for getting married because you can't really there's no anonymity in culture that would let you get away with a lot of things. It's a really interesting kind of small laboratory experience. And they're really like untested reciprocity where I'm from is never really untested. So say you call up your neighbor and you borrow his shovel, right? He knows that one day you will also, you know that one day he will also come and ask you for something. And if he comes and wants to, I don't know, borrow your pen and you don't have a frying pan, then you have to offer something else. Like it has to be always in equilibrium. And everybody knows. And if you don't do it, if you deny the favor, you're kind of gone. Like there will be severe social consequences, like decaying, right? And it was really interesting to me to see how in the US it's not so, especially in very feminized cultures. So favors are a little bit like an option, and you're not really supposed to test it. So it remains this Schrodinger's cat in a way, because until you test it, we can both pretend that you would return my favor. But when you actually test it, it's kind of 50-50. And for me, that was a very interesting, because it's seemingly similar. And I think what you're saying is that it used to be different, that maybe when it was a more masculine culture in the US, and particularly in the male world of Wolf of Wall Street, it was more similar to how it is today in Hungary.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd never thought about it as a male-female thing. Of course, Cialdini in Influence kind of leads with reciprocity. If you haven't read Influence, anyone listening or watching, really read it. It is kind of an instruction manual on how to understand if people are trying to influence you and the techniques that they use. But reciprocity is a big one, right? So I would use reciprocity as kind of a filter. And by that, I mean, I would always be willing to do somebody a favor if it didn't violate any of, my own way of doing things. And then you watch, right? And at some point, you're going to ask that person, hey, could you hook me up with this person? Or I don't know them, I'd love to meet them, etc. Those that don't do it generally are saying quite a bit about themselves. And so it's a great way to screen for how you're going to interact with that person. And, it is deep in our DNA that we reciprocate.
And we get attached to people that we do favors to, right? According to research. So I don't know, if I bake you cookies, then I will kind of retroactively rationalize, oh, I like Jim. That's why I baked him cookies. Otherwise, I would be crazy, right? Like why, like it's such an. But anyway, I just want to clarify that it's not that I think that feminine culture has less proclivity to be doing favors. I think it's more that when you combine male and female cultures, which we are trying to do now in society, you introduce a lower level of legibility, because there is some kind of lack of transparency between men and women in interesting ways. So it's easier to get away with, because what we're talking about is like creating cultures where you can get away with not reciprocating or not acting in a virtuous way, whatever that means.
Right.
Right? Which will lower social trust, which will, do away with consequences. And, we are kind of like one step closer to anomie. And for me, it's very interesting because obviously it's a more virtuous system to have men and women work together and live together and create together. But it does introduce these challenges that you are combining two cultures.
Yeah, it's kind of like as I'm listening to you, maybe I was just incredibly lucky to be the martini baby with a bunch of big sisters bossing me around. I remember I was at a cocktail party talking to a woman that I just met,
Be
and we
careful
were
with the
having
martinis.
and we were having a conversation and going back and forth. And then about 5 minutes into the conversation, she put her hand on my arm. She goes, Can I ask you a personal question?" And I went, Sure." She goes, "How many sisters do you have?" And I went, "Well, I had four older sisters. I now have three. Unfortunately, my eldest sister died." And and I said, "Why?" And she goes, "You speak woman." I just laughed, of course. But now, in context, maybe I do. Maybe I was lucky that I was trained in the female language as well.
It's not illegible. I mean,
No.
you have that with cross generation. I mean, how many people will tell you, like, I don't know how to work with my Gen Z employees. I have a boomer boss, whatever. Like you have lack of legibility between generations as well, because it's different cultures. And by culture, I don't just mean the norms that are kind of like intrinsically drive us, but like what we expect from other people to do, right?
Hmm.
It's like, you ask your millennial employee XYZ, they will understand the severity, urgency, immutability of that request at a completely different level from how you do. And I see, I mean, the only hope for peace, and peaceful collaboration and cooperation in society is if we figure out how to speak each other's language. I mean, what is the other option?
I completely agree. I mean, the paraphrasing of Kipling, it seems to be our current situation where we are islands of misunderstanding, or we are separate islands shouting at each other over seas of misunderstanding, right?
Like the
And
end of La Dolce Vita, right? When they don't hear, but they both want to communicate. The beauty
exactly.
of it. And this is, you
Yeah.
understand this. Like you do want to communicate. It's not that you don't. It's like you just don't hear each other.
The biggest question at the end of every interaction is to ask yourself, did actual communication take place, right? Because if I am a dog and you
Good
are a cat
question.
and I say woof and you go meow, it might be very difficult for us to understand one another. And so I always attempt to try to understand how other people communicate ideas.
Yeah.
And back in the 70s when I was a teenager, I stumbled on the work of the neuro-linguistic programmers. And they took language and communication very, very seriously. And what they did was identify that there are different types of communication and the way people process information. So a lot of people are visual, right? The majority, in fact, are visual communicators. Can you see the big picture? Can you see what I'm saying, right? Others are auditory. Does that ring a bell? Does that sound right to you? Well, the minute you realize that if you're a visual communicator and you're talking to an auditory person, they literally don't see the big picture. They can hear the bell, and that sounds right to them. And so one of the things that I learned early on was to listen for the clues, and then change the way I express things so that they could literally interpret the signal, right?
I love that. And this is why, I mean, English is basically my third language, right? So I live in my third language. And I think when you live in a different linguistic environment from, where you were socialized, you start seeing language in a very different way because you understand that there is something underneath language and that for me, the first time when I really seriously immigrated for good, that had become a deep fascination for me. Like, what is underneath? Why is it that some things I remember in English, some things I remember in Hungarian, some things I remember in French? Why is it that numbers work differently for me in different languages? And there's a reason why, when we talk about Girard, when we talk about all these people, they are immigrants. Like, it's the immigrant who becomes obsessed with the imitation, with the social lie, or at least outsider, recent arrival, like all these people, gay, trans, different, because you want to see this kind of stage-like quality of life where everybody's wearing costumes in some set and enacting something, and see, I understand that this is the social reality, but kind of what is underneath it. And I do think that when we talk about tweaking the language, don't, like, if everything is jargon, if an industry, a generation, a social group is obsessed and kind of adamant at keeping their own language, and they want to force it on the other group, no, just tweak the production. If it's dark in the room, change the pantomime into music, because the goal is the mutual information in the channel. Language is there to convey meaning. I don't care about your big words or your formulae or whatever you're using in your industry. Can you translate? Can we meet in the middle? And I think that, and one thing that I'm noticing on people who work with financial markets is you have to do that. You can't communicate with the markets at the level of complexity as how you think. And I really want to go back to the 80s with you a little bit. I'm an 80s child, so I do have some very foggy memories of this era. Why is it that you were algorithmic in an era of personal reputation? And is it in any way related to the fact that you are an insane level journal writer? I mean, one of the most emblematic photos that I've ever seen of you is just a heap of notebooks. You're not even in the picture. How did journaling start, and how did it lead you, if it did lead you, to thinking algorithmically about the markets?
So, wow, that's an interesting question. So, journaling started when I was a teenager, and it started just because I was curious about why I thought some of the things I thought. And I remembered my dad saying to me, well, you know what you should do is write it out. Because if you can't write it out, you don't actually think that. And if you actually think that, you are not thinking properly. So what you need to do is write it out to see what you think. And I kind of scoffed, as any 17-year-old boy would.
What
But
would
then
a 17-year-old hyperactive boy want more than to sit down on his ass and write?
Exactly.
Really, in his spare time. That's what all 17-year-old boy want.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it made sense to me. And like at the same time, I love poetry, and I decided, I think it would be fun to memorize a bunch of poems. So at one point, I had 100 different poems memorized. And I was just
Like
fascinated
what? Which
by,
poems did you memorize?
oh, well, I mean, the first one was the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by Eliot. Lots of Shakespeare sonnets. Basically, if we're being honest here, ones that could woo potential girlfriends also worked highly in my favor. Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress was a real good one.
Listen, yeah, that gets women going. Listeners and viewers, John Donne.
Yeah, and John Donne, several of his poems, actually used a Donne poem as the second reading in our wedding in 1982, because my wife and I both loved it. It's called The Good Morrow, the poem. But that interaction was really interesting to me. I was always a reader. And again, my dad was very helpful there. I was very upset when I was sort of punished for going through all of a reading assignment when I was in third grade. And I read all the way through the eighth grade level. And rather than send me to the library, I went to a Catholic school. And even though it was Vatican II, they made me sit at my desk with my hands like this on the desk. I'm holding my hands up to show a Christmas tree. And I was meant to,
Looks
uh,
seriously like the Illuminati pyramid,
yeah.
kind of ironically.
But I honestly think that is probably what made me so anti-authoritarian, because I really thought it was idiotic to make me sit there and punish me essentially for being smart. And so, why didn't you send me to the library? Why didn't you do all these things? So I went home and I said to my mom and dad, I read through the SRA reading program all the way to the eighth grade and I got them all right. And what did they do? They punished me. And my mom was like, "Oh, that's too bad, honey." And my dad just looked at me and he goes, "Come here." And he walked me to the library and he pointed at the Encyclopedia Britannica. He pulled out the first volume and he handed it to me and he goes, "Read this." Which I did. And so I still have it actually, because it was very meaningful to me. But the journaling was kind of an outgrowth of that. I mean, like I was always a writer. I still have the first book I ever wrote when I was bored one summer. I think it was 11 or 12, maybe 10. Anyway, I was saying to my mom, "Oh, what should I do? What should I do? What should I do?" And she goes, "Write a book." And so I have it. It's like 120 handwritten pages.
What is
Horrible,
that?
horrible, horrible. It was
No,
science fiction, actually. It was
that's
science
amazing.
fiction, and it was a guy who had come back to life. I can't remember the way I brought him back to life, but he came to life in the future, and there were everything was different, and educational centers and all this type of things. But I also found in journaling that it was really great to spark ideas. Ideas, if you don't grab them and you don't document them, you don't put them down, you forget them. And so by constantly being in the practice of just writing every day, and then by the way, I did it every day for a while, but then I stopped doing it every day. And I basically did it whenever I was trying to figure something out or like, what do I really think of this? And so, I mean, if you looked at my journals, I'm pulling one up here from like when I was in my early 20s, they they cover a lot of ground, let's put it that way. Like I got fascinated by things like, how many realities are there and can we pick them? And like what if we do a quantum wave
Normal
and then
stuff.
and so here's a formula, right? Energy of thoughts, dreams, aspirations equals energy of mind times energy of action times energy of randomness squared, because lots of random shit happens in the world. You got to pay attention to it. And the way to get lucky is to increase your surface area of luck by trying to pay attention to things that are a bit out of the ordinary and say, "Oh, is there an opportunity here?" The great thing here, though, and my friend Chris Williamson pointed it out to me, he goes, if energy of action equals zero, your total output equals zero. And so, yeah, I was fascinated by a lot of different things. And
And
so
how old
document
were you when you created this framework?
23.
Okay. So there is something in the notebooks that made you go algorithmic, right?
Oh,
You did it a lot
absolutely.
and you started
Yeah,
noticing
yeah.
patterns and you
Um,
were like, what is outside the pattern and why? And does it mean that there's another pattern starting there? What's going on?
Exactly. And so I'm a big believer in systems theory, right? In this same book, I have a long essay about why the USSR would have to collapse. And it was all based on the underlying system that I saw in the USSR, which was rotten to its core. Potemkin villages everywhere, everyone lying to everyone else. And that type of system, generally speaking, decays and collapses, and often violently. But so, yeah, interested in looking beneath the surface and saying, okay, can I understand this particular thing as a system? If I can, then I can identify what are the key attributes that I'm going to need to understand in that system. And then I had an experience in 1987 during the great crash of 1987, which was what flipped me into being a total quant. And that was, I had a system back then which was very mathematical and essentially had me going into the crash of 1987 with the biggest position in puts, which gives you the right to sell stock. In other words, if you're buying puts, you're expecting the market to go down. And I was very nervous because they were nearing expiration and they were finally slightly in the money. And I emotionally overrode my system and sold them all. Guess when? The day before the stock market crashed. And so, there was a great cartoon called Pogo, and there's a shot. He's some form of animal. Anyway, there's a great shot of Pogo saying, "We've met the enemy, and it's us." If you look at most systems, where do the errors occur? Hello, we humans. We're amazing at creating stuff. We're amazing at creativity and innovation and all those things. But we also are the weakest link in any underlying system. And so I applied that to Wall Street. And I'm like, you know what? I'm running human OS just like everyone else. So I am not the exception. When I convince myself, listen, no, it's not everyone else who's fucking things up. You are too. And you just gave yourself the absolute best example of that you're going to fuck it up too if you make an emotional decision. And so I'm just kind of like, all right, I'm going to build the models and make sure that I can test them, stress test them, but then I am going to adhere to them. Somebody asked me at when I was leaving O'Shaughnessy Asset Management, like what I was most proud of. And my answer was I was most proud of the fact that I never emotionally overrode one of our algorithmic models. And they're like, huh, like that's kind of a weird thing to be proud of. And I'm like, not at all. If you're a quantitative investor and you base everything you're doing based on a model that you're able to test over as much data as possible, able to see the worst case scenarios, able to see the worst day, the worst year, et cetera, and then you, because of your emotions, override that, all of your previous track record is negated because you made an emotional override. The first book that I wrote, Invest Like the Best, which was published in 93 or 4, essentially was, hey, you can clone your favorite portfolio manager. Don't listen to what they say. Simply take their portfolio, put them on a huge data set of all stocks in the country you're examining, and then see what the biggest deviations from the market are. Turn around, make those screens to look for stocks with those particular characteristics, and voila, you end up with a portfolio that performs very much like your favorite manager. The fun thing about that, though, which underlines the point about emotional overrides, is we used to update those clone portfolios of the famous managers that we covered in the book. And the last time we updated them, all of the clones were beating the underlying manager that they were cloning. Why?
Because the managers were making the emotional decisions.
Exactly. Exactly.
What is a good time to make an emotional decision?
Well, anything having to do with your relationships with other people. It is, I have found at least, that it's very helpful to not be Spock all the time. You got to be a little Captain Kirk as well, because interacting with people that you love, people that you respect, etc. You've got to, as I grew older, I realized I used to be a real proselytizer, right? I used to be, this is the only way. If you really want to do well, hear me, wake up, wake up, wake up. And then as I got older and fucked a lot of things up in life, as one does, I came to understand that we all of us, we humans, are remarkably more fragile than we let on. And so understanding that, you are drawn to giving people's and others a bit more grace, a bit more room for, you know, something that you think is wrong. But you have to always remind yourself, well, first look in the mirror, and if you can introspect and understand that you're just the same, and you are often making those types of decisions in the heat of the moment, and, you know, that means others are going to do it as well, then emotions are very, very important.
Do you think that it's because human relation, I mean, even one individual is quite complex, unless it's in a super, super predictable environment, right? Like somebody has to go pee and they are standing next to a toilet. You can kind of figure out what's going to happen here, right? But this is rarely so simple in life. But then you put, even if you just put like two people together, the complexity increases significantly. And we just don't have good enough quantitative systems to model that. And so your best guess is kind of to rely on the norms and the intuitions that you feel and you assume the other person to be feeling. But I think, I mean, one of the things that I'm realizing the older I get, and it actually is changing my relationships with people in kind of a fundamental way, is that the animal is really wise. So you have a base level of really, really strong intuitions about each other. I have a very beloved friend who is a neuroscientist and researches animal decision making, and particularly confidence in decisions. And they kind of research that by how long an animal will wait around for an expected reward. Like the longer you wait, the more confident you are that it's going to come, and how you can mess with animals. But they always say, these scientists, that animal decision making is almost 100% good. Like you really, really, really have to mind fuck an animal to not have a really logical response to a stimulus. But humans, it's much more complicated, right? We have a level where fear, happiness, hope, pleasure are very like they are well placed. And then we override this, right? That's the correct data. And we override this with not the emotional decision, but the rational one. Like, oh, I'm sure he's fine. I can get into his car. Like that's to have a very, very, or like, I'm sure this milk is still good. It's a little bit like clumpy inside as I shake it, but it will be fine. It will be good in the pancakes. And then, the whole family suffers. And to me, that's really, really interesting. And I mean, there are people whose hope is that it can be quantified, right? That we'll figure out a way where he doesn't have to stress on a date because he will have a perfect model to what to say, which Andrew Marvell, John Donne, Shakespeare, whoever to pull out of his hat. But we are very, very far from it, right? But then how do you teach people to have that kind of social wisdom, especially in an era where social wisdoms are so discounted and suspicious, and don't trust your gut, be a Bayesian? Yeah, of course, at the stock market, but not necessarily home with your son, right?
Yeah. I think that there is definitely a thing which I would call saturated intuition. And by that I mean, if over your career or your life, you just keep seeing the same pattern, your intuition improves about that pattern pretty remarkably. And so, you mentioned Girard, and humans are incredibly mimetic. And for the most part, that's a good thing because it allows us to learn by copying, right? And Douglas Adams,
I
who
also think it's
many,
good. And actually, Girard also comes to the conclusion that there is good, like, if you have to be mimetic, then just find better things. I mean, that's his whole argument for Christianity. Like, it's good that you want to copy Jesus. Like, that's generally good.
well, I was talking with a colleague yesterday or the day before, and we were talking about, memes, and people confuse, I think, often memes with the funny pictures that we see on Twitter or Instagram. No, 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 no. Memes in the Dawkins sense of mind worms that become very compelling. You know that a meme is successful when the originator of the meme loses control of it. And essentially, I think one of the greatest memers in history was St. Paul, Saul, before he became Paul.
So he was the
And
email marketing person. He literally found the biggest religion in the world just by sending out marketing emails. It's great.
he was the best marketer in the world. He was so mimetically contagious that like literally he could convert an entire village by just one talk, right? And the way he did it was really interesting. It was like, you know what? I'm not here to tell you that you can't continue to worship your tree god or your frog gods or whatever kind of gods you worship in your village. I'm here to tell you the better news. There is one God that rules over all of them. And guess what? He doesn't care what village you were born in. He doesn't care what sex you were. He doesn't care what color you are. Everybody gets to worship him. Very inclusive, big tent. And so these ideas
Not
were
like the Jews,
incredibly,
where we're like, you can convert to Judaism, but it's going to hurt.
but that's a really interesting comparison, right? Because Jews didn't proselytize. They were like, leave
But
those
the
people.
whole point was that it's so exclusive, right?
Exactly.
That the price of conversion is really high, and there was a reason for that.
Super high. And like you can't be a Jew unless your mother is a Jew. It comes down the maternal line, not the paternal line. Lots of rules. Really tough it's a tough club to get into. And St. Paul was like, hey, that's really hard. You're gonna have to study the Torah. You're gonna have to memorize shit. You don't have to do any of that with us over here. Come on in, and the water's fine. And so, like, it's fascinating to me that it created the one of the largest religions in human history. And so the idea of memes as jokes misses the much larger point of like mimetic influence is a really interesting, really fascinating thing to watch, right? It's like I'm not terribly interested in the people who throw the fourth or fifth stone. I'm interested in the person who throws the first stone because
Me too.
that's
That's so interesting. Say more. And I'm going to, yeah, yeah. That's fascinating. I never heard this framing. Tell me more.
the person who throws the first stone is, if they were taking the big five, they're going to score very low on agreeableness.
Never happened.
And so the person who throws the second stone might be of some interest. Everyone from three on, not interest. They're mimetically copying the first two. And what happens are these cascades of behavior. It's like crowds. Why are crowds interesting? Because in different contexts, crowds can be smart or they can be raving idiots, right? And when you have a smart crowd, the wisdom of crowd, Jim Surowiecki wrote the book on that. And to be a smart crowd, you have to have diversity of opinion. It has to be heterogeneous, not homogeneous, right? Because that's where you get to better information being filtered, in a Bayesian way, right? And didn't Francis Galton go to the village fair and was interested in the guesses that all the farmers were making on the weight of the heifer, and whoever guessed closest won the cow, right? And so he came along and he's like, yeah, I'm not interested in that, but can I have all of those guesses, please? And what he found was by adding them all up and taking the average of all of the guesses was actually closer to the weight of the cow than even the best individual guess, right? So crowds can be incredibly wise. That's why that leads in markets, for example. Don't get into a fight with Mr. Market because Mr. Market's going to win.
Yeah.
One of the things that I learned, and it informs everything I do, right? If I think something, if I passionately believe in it and the market tells me I'm wrong, I'm wrong, right?
Yeah.
It's like Feynman on research data, right? If you love that theory, but all of your experiments show that that theory is a null set, you're wrong. Move on.
Hmm.
Now, you can also have dumb crowds. What are dumb crowds? Dumb crowds are generally there's the person throwing the first stone and then a lot of copycats. And that's where we get to the animal nature of we domesticated primates. It's helpful to kind of think of ourselves that way, right? It's like we have these massive brains, which are incredibly cool, but we don't have an owner's manual for them.
Yeah.
And so we
I
have to
always say
kind
it's
of,
a supercomputer in a monkey. And that's
yeah,
exactly how it works.
yeah, we've got these, quantum supercomputers up here and we're running around with them and there's no owner's manual. And so like there's a lot of ways that you
The
can
monkey's
improve
like,
the way
I
we
need a
think.
burger.
Exactly.
That's a
Exactly
nice
right.
theory on a let's get a burger.
Yeah. Yeah, let's stop. This is
I love
well,
it.
but that's the other thing, right? So thinking is calorically taxing. You
Yeah,
would probably be better off if you understand that you need to be a cognitive miser where you place your attention, what you give your attention to. If you're truly thinking about it, it's an expensive activity,
it's the new,
right?
it's perceiving, remembering, understanding new things. It's very metabolically expensive, right? So you
Yes.
will save on that all the time.
Yeah. And so distractions have a very high cost. The cost there is you are expending your mental budget, cognitive budget on worthless shit.
Hmm.
And, you're going to deplete that budget if you just spend all of your time thinking, I think I'm just going to scroll Instagram all day and wonder about the people who do this versus trying to get to the bottom of a particular way of looking at the world. And so, one of the things that's always been very helpful for me is I'm very open to the idea that I'm probably wrong.
Yeah.
And, if you and I had access to a time machine and we went back just 500 years, right? And we knew who the 100 smartest people were then, and we managed to gather them all together and started querying them on their beliefs, what we would find is that probably 95% of those beliefs were totally
Totally,
wrong.
totally
And
wrong.
so, what makes me special is why should I believe ever that all those smart people were wrong in most of their beliefs, but no, 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 I'm correct in all of mine? It's the whole David Deutsch beginning of infinity argument. We can't, one of the kinks in human OS is that we think we have total knowledge. We don't.
But I'm really curious if you put together the 100 smartest people to guess the cow, I think that their average would not be as correct as if you created an actual assortment of intelligence, right? So there's
Oh,
this other problem
absolutely.
that smart
Like,
people really, really skew one way. And by smart, I mean like different smart in
I
classical music, different smart in quantum mechanics. These are different kinds of intelligence. But like I think we actually do this thing where we're trying to define the weight of the cow by asking the smartest people, but maybe their guess counts as just one of the 100.
yeah.
And you would have to have every kind of, every of the whole spectrum to guess to get to the actual reality.
So what you're talking about is cognitive diversity, something I believe deeply in, right?
Interact
So,
versus TED Talks, right? Like the truth is in the conversation. It's not just the smart person saying and then being like, well, we're done here, let's go home. No, 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 no. We're just starting.
and the cult of accreditation was what made that even more pronounced, right? If you didn't graduate from this particular university and have this particular set of friends or this particular set of beliefs, then you weren't going to be an expert, you weren't going to be called on, et cetera, et cetera. I passionately believe that I have a lot of blind spots. And so when I'm putting colleagues in place at a company, I intentionally look for people who think differently than I do, because Ogilvy had this thing where he would call a meeting, and on the chairs of all of the conference room table, chairs around the conference table, he'd put nested Russian dolls. You've seen them, of course. You keep opening them, and there's a smaller one and a smaller one. And then he would say, "We hire giants here because we want this company to be comprised of giants. If you keep hiring people smaller, meaning not as smart as you, not as quick as you, etc. In other words, people aren't going to threaten you. You'll become small. You'll become insignificant." And so one of the things that, the way I look at my things that I do is I'm at best a co-creator. At best, right? Like this idea that it's my idea and it's precious and it's mine and I'm not going to share it with anyone. I don't think the world works that way. And so I find that you can come up with much better ways of doing things by having a very cognitively diverse team working on it. And that's
Not
what
to
you
mention
get
a lot of
with
people
those farmers.
and that they did something alone turn out to actually have a huge team, a wife, a husband, friends helping, right?
Exactly. And so I think it is sort of the height of early arrogance to think that you have uniquely come up with this particular brilliant idea, right? I mean, just think about Newton and Leibniz, right? Talk about a
Don't
fight for
bring it
the
up. Don't bring it up. You unleashed the calculus wars on my podcast. Oh my God. The
but the point
comments are
is,
going to go crazy.
but I also use that as a litmus test if we're developing something, right? If we're developing a product or a service or anything within OSV, I look very carefully for, is there competition? Because guess what? If there isn't competition, you're wrong.
There you go.
So you definitely want to see other people thinking about the same thing at a similar time. It's like that quote: no matter how brilliant a person, no matter how insightful, no matter how well read, you can't ask them to make a list of things that would never occur to them. And what you want to do is you're building out a team is to have it very diverse in its cognitive way of looking at the world. That is the way you uncover your blind spots. That's the way that you make the whole better than just doing it. We're going to do it my way or it's the highway. That's not an efficient way to run anything.
To go back to Girard and this idea of the first stone, I feel like maybe the way in which people might misunderstand Girard is that, in my assessment, a lot of his theories are not as negative as they are presented. He was a very grumpy French chain-smoking guy, so a lot of things that he says, sound very dramatic. But I always feel that he leaves a little surface for hope. I just did a salon with Peter Thiel in Miami, and of course we talked deeply about Girard, but I also, in a different way, kind of came up with the first stone question: who throws the first stone? To me, that's not necessarily negative. To me, feeling that I don't accept the fact that all desire is mimetic. I think there are innate desires, and I think especially when you're raising small children, you understand that there are things that kind of come from the child. It's their very direct response to some external event or internal event, right? Like a physical state. And then there are extremely imitative things that children do. And you do kind of know the difference. And I do think that we're just like bigger babies. I don't see how there would be an ontological difference between somebody who is 2 years old or 62 years old. That's kind of the same thing. And for me, the first stone also seems not necessarily a value judgment. I mean, the stone, of course, in this particular thing, but like first action, the first mover, that can be both good and bad. I mean, depending on what you do with it, right? Is it the first stone? Is it a cornerstone of a new building that nobody else wanted to build? And now you've put it down, other people are joining in and they are very mimetic, but you were not. You just need a place to live. Or is it to destroy somebody, in which case, please put the stone down and step away from the car, right? Like these are two very, very, very different things. And for me, I always wonder about that. You say, oh, you're a 17-year-old boy, you start journaling that well, everybody else is, I don't know, like playing basketball in the court. You sit down to write your journals because you ask yourself the great question of life, which is, what do I think? Which actually means, what do people think? Which actually means, why do people do what they do?
Mm.
All inquiry is basically like in screenwriting, you have why every scene has to either move the plot forward or reveal a character. Why? Because if it doesn't move forward, you don't want to watch the movie anymore. And if you don't reveal a character, you will not later on understand why the character is doing what they are doing. And so basically all social sciences, all inquiry, all quanting is that. Why do people think what they think? Why do they do what they do? And why do I think what I think? And why do I do what I do? But what made you interested?
So, just on Girard, first off, I think that far too many people love to look at things through just a single lens. And I think that's a mistake. So I became interested in Girard because I thought it could be helpful in teaching me why markets perform the way they do. Markets are highly mimetic. Art markets, very, very mimetic. In fact, I did a thread on Twitter using Kate Winslet from the role she had in Titanic. And I imagined what would happen if the ship didn't sink and she actually married Cal, and all of that, the art that they thought was primitive scratchings, of course, Van Gogh, Picasso, etc. How would
the movie, the Demoiselle d'Avignon gets destroyed, right? But I've seen it. So anyway.
Yeah, no. But my point is, like, it is a hallmark of kind of either or, yes, no, 0, 100 deterministic thought. To say it is this, not that. It is like I'm all in on Girard's analysis. I like Robert Anton Wilson's. I don't have any beliefs, but I have many suspicions. And keeping your aperture as wide as possible gets you to a better understanding as you synthesize various things that make sense, like Girardian theory of mimetic behavior, but you don't go all in, right? You're not like, Girard's going to explain everything. My opinion is that the truth ought to be predictive. And if I have a various group of mental models that are making predictions, I can look at how well they do. And if they're not doing all that well, I know I need to upgrade them. And I know that I have to unlearn certain things and learn new things. And so I try to look at it through kind of I don't know, a synthesized kaleidoscope, as it were. It's not just Girard. I know people love his underlying theories or hate, right? And I think, okay, but they're just one aspect to trying to develop a better understanding. And so, like,
Metabolically cheaper to just settle on one thing.
much. And so I would rather spend some of the calories and say, well, okay, he's very good on why certain desires are the way they are, but you made a really good point. If you have children, they are a wake-up call to saying that things are all basically all desires mimetic. That's bullshit. I mean, like, their personalities begin to emerge, and we have 3 kids. And so my son, who was the firstborn, certain personality. My next was a daughter, very different personality that started emerging at kind of like age 2. And my wife and I used to joke, we had our third child, another daughter, just to see if our son and daughter, the first two, were complete opposites. And the fact is, like, we are not born as blank slates. If you're a behaviorist, the arrogance of the behaviorists in the like 1940s and 50s, like if you give me any baby, and you tell me you want this baby to be a doctor or a lawyer or a baker or a street cleaner, that's what they're going to become. Bullshit. Like, wrong, wrong, wrong. We are not born with a blank slate. We are born with a lot of our personalities, which end up emerging. Now, I'm not going to say I know exactly how that happens. I'm sure it's a mixture of genetic and early influence. And, Timothy Leary had the idea that we get imprinted at very young ages against our will, right? Like, our parents, our siblings, all of these people are imprinting us. Now, his terminology is antiquated, but like, so Leary would say, before you even turn two, you're already imprinted as top dog or bottom dog, and you're given a winner's script or a loser's script. And like, are those irrevocable? No, but they're goddamn hard to change if that was what you were imprinted on at an early age. Now, of course, Leary thought, easy peasy. We'll just give them a huge dose of LSD, put them in a lily tank, a sensory deprivation tank, and voila. But the point being, there are so many different strands that make us who we are, right? And if you think that you stand apart from society, you're only fooling yourself, right? Because there are a million things that influence us, that many of which we're completely unaware of. And as you keep going down a list trying to say, why am I this way? Why do I have this belief? And you keep digging and digging and digging. I mean, oftentimes you can find just a silly imprinting that happened, that's why you are the way you are about that particular thing.
Even of the three Polgar girls, only two are chess grandmasters, right? And they all get the same education. And probably that's one of the most intentional way of ever trying to raise geniuses. And then it also went in three different ways, right?
Absolutely. And to me, that's joyful. Talk about
Yes.
hope. Like what gives me hope is that there's all kinds of different people with different gifts in the world. And now we're at a place in the world where that's like why we do the fellowships. In the old days, geniuses were born, lived, and died without even knowing that they were a genius, right? Because they were isolated by clan, they were isolated by geography, they were
They
isolated
were
by
not literate.
tradition.
They had
They
no
were illiterate, right? Like the list goes on and on and on. But now, with the interconnected world that we live in, we can see those geniuses.
Yeah.
We can find them, and in our case, we can fund them. I'm very interested in those kinds of edge. I love non-consensus thinking because a lot of it's nonsense, but a lot of it is like really, really interesting. And so, yeah, will we bet wrong? Of course we will. But like the idea is put the bet down.
And I'm hosting the Tocqueville Democracy in America reading series on Interact now. And I really, really love the part in part two. We've just actually done the session for that, where he talks about the moral pressure around dissent. And basically his understanding of, an embedded danger in democracy is obviously the tyranny of the majority, and that would lead to conformism, and that would lead to some kind of penalty for the dissenters. And I do feel that yes, we live in a much more genius-friendly era. And you can see in Tocqueville's system how to go back to the Soviet Union, Jim born in the Soviet Union, idea, there is something in liberal democracies that opened the floor for dissent and original thinking by either raising the reward or lowering the penalty. But it's never a completely solved problem. And we see that today, right? Like there's a reason why we call it fuck you money, right? That you have to have some kind of leverage in society. You have to be on one end or the other of the bell curve to really be free to dissent. And if you're pushed into the middle where everybody else is, it gets more complicated. And we see what people do and how they deal with it, right? If you have a very, I mean, I used to joke that when I first became an adult, and my social circles were kind of mixed at the time. There were people with very weird jobs, very kind of weirdo humans like myself doing strange nonconformist things in their lives. And so the kind of normie people would come to us, tell us about their escapades and their weird private life things. And I was like, I would never do that. Like, my life is so interesting, You are in the bank the whole day, and then when you finish at 9 p.m., you go and you get crazy. I go home and read books and sleep. That's what I do. But like, there will be some kind of escape somewhere. And I do think that society is better off if that search for excess doesn't go into, I don't know, social or self destruction, but you actually allow people to have entertained strange ideas and make social mistakes and say weird things without enormous social penalty of like losing your job, getting canceled, your girlfriend leaving you, whatever. But I feel that this is not a solved problem at all. And I don't know how it was. We jokingly talk about the excesses of the 80s. I really, really want to talk to you about the 90s as well, because talk about another extremely hubristic decade. But I feel like, do you feel that we're better off with weirdos these days? Or is the internet somehow really kind of engendering the conformity, and everybody's weird the same way, and all the contrarians are actually saying the same things? I feel like there's something not resolved there.
Yeah, I think that the internet and our interconnectivity is on balance a positive thing. And I think it's a positive thing because voices that didn't have microphones weren't heard. And I am quite willing to let a lot of the nonsense people with their microphone talk a bunch of bullshit, because it also gives people with really great ideas an opportunity to do the same. And so we have a lot more noise, but there's also a lot more signal as well, in my opinion. And the idea of the conformity, like the 1950s is kind of, I look at it as the most conformist decade, at least in America.
Which is
Um,
crazy how much the contemporary center right idolizes the 50s. That's like the definite optimist, innovating
yeah. So
America, but like on the
I
basic
think
level, it was very confining, right?
I think that we also sort of like, I really dislike labels, and like the Republican Democrat of the United States, or left right, like the left right grew out of where the people sat in Parliament, right, in France, I think. And I think that we're beyond those old traditional things. And like, by that I mean, they if you could infer all of my social and political beliefs by only hearing one of them, then I am a brain dead ideologue. And
Then
this
you're
idea
great at one work, yeah.
and this idea, like, who demands purity tests? People with really weak ideas. They want, it's all or nothing. You've got to, these are the talking points, these are the belief statements. You're in our little club if you have passed the purity test. I'm not passing any purity tests. And like but if you study, for example, cults, if you study religions, if you study social systems, these are pretty effective ways to get people to comply with what you want them to do. And so I think that more broadly, yes, to answer your question, yes, the 50s were kind of the height of conformity, but I also think of the 50s as an anomaly. Like, people are like, oh, isn't you the way it used to be? America used to be king of the world. Well, we conveniently leave out the part where, we had this world war where we destroyed the industrial capacity of virtually everyone else in the world, or our enemies did to our allies. And so it was not normal that one country got to produce 85% of all the automobiles in the world, like America did in the 1950s. That was an abnormality which grew out of the carnage that happened in World War II. And so we also were basically aiming everything at the one standard deviation on either side of the bell curve, 68.5%. Like I Love Lucy, 70 million people would watch a regular episode of I Love Lucy. And then you look at like Game of Thrones. What was their biggest audience? Like 18.5 million people. And so culture was much more homogenized, much more inflicted, if you will, because like you had 3 TV stations and 2 newspapers, right? You had the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and you had ABC, NBC, and CBS.
But
And
that was not good. Like,
no, I agree. I agree
I know that,
completely.
but there's this kind of reactionism, right? In amongst millennials, at least in my generation, because we only kind of remember the tail end of this. And no, it was not good. It was extremely
No.
like you would
And
lose your mind if you were sent back to Pleasantville, to live in the hair.
right.
And there's a reason why people started new magazines and TV stations, because it was really bad.
Exactly. And now we have the ability to start a shitload more new magazines, a shitload more new everything. Will all of it be good? Of course not. Most of it will be crap. But that's the idea. You've got to let 1,000 ideas bloom. And the vast majority of those ideas are going to like wither and die because they're not good ideas. But the opportunity to let 1,000 new ideas bloom is your podcast is the hope axis. My God, what gives me greater hope than that? That people now like to be an oddball, to be a heretic in the old days was literally a very expensive bet. Like, if they didn't like what you were saying, they burned your ass at the stake or they drowned you. Let's see if she's a witch. Right? If she drowns,
CIA would come and fund you, which is even
yeah.
worse.
So, but the point is, we now have we've gone from a normal distribution, right, with 68.5% in the middle to a Mandelbrot chaotic distribution. We have a much peakier middle, right? And we have these very long tails. I'm fascinated by what's in those tails. There's a lot of gold in them there tails. And there's also a lot of fool's gold. You have to be understanding that sometimes you're going to get it wrong.
I have
But
a little sachet of fool's gold in my house that I've been emigrating with for years through multiple countries as a kind of reminder.
yeah,
From
it's good to
California.
remember. It's good to remember. But the price for blasphemy or heresy in the old days was your life,
Yeah.
often.
Yeah.
And like if compared to now, oh, somebody might try to cancel me or somebody might be mean to me on the internet. Who gives a shit? Like the cost of being different today has plummeted. It's plummeted. And so I love it. I think that, look, with all of the new innovations, with all of the new technologies, we're getting such a big lever. You remember Archimedes, right? Give me a lever and I can move the world. We, we are creating the biggest levers the world has ever seen for human imagination and creativity. And, just to get worried about that, I to me at least, is to miss the point entirely. Like you're not going to be required to be enthusiastic about this particular innovation or that particular innovation, but just keep your mind open and your aperture wide and what a great time to be alive. That's the other thing. Like literally, I was in Africa and what a mind-blowing experience that is. I love Africans and Africa. And if you get an opportunity to go there, I highly recommend you do it because it allows you to see the world from a completely different angle. But like so much of the things that we enjoy are really kind of new. I got into the habit after a lot of cold showers over in Africa. Every time I get into a hot shower, I thank the universe, right? Like, how fucking lucky am I that I can turn a knob and get hot water? Like, we won the cosmic lottery. Everyone who is living right now, it's like the odds against are so astronomical that you should be unbelievably grateful to be alive at this point in human history. And yet, many people, it's like the Louis C.K. bit about Wi-Fi on an airplane, right? He's like, you get on the plane, you're at 30,000 feet, and you discover that your Wi-Fi works. And you are like, this is amazing. I can't believe it. What a cool thing. And then the minute it goes out, you're like, what the fuck? and
I'm suffering. Yes.
yeah, I'm now suffering. I mean, my God, people used to die from getting splinters.
Yes.
And this is just so lost on us.
Yeah.
We are so new. This incredibly cornucopia of wonders that is our world is so new. You'd think about it like the guy who announced Lindbergh's return to the United States on radio, right? He was the first person in human history to address that number of human beings ever in history. That was like 100 years ago. And so we are so new, and look how far we've come. Are there problems? Of course, there will always be problems. But let's just hope that the problems get to be better problems, not worse problems.
I love it. And I absolutely agree. I also feel that, when people talk about hardship, like, of course, we all have hardship in our lives. We have sadness and illness and grief, that's kind of part of the deal. But I always think that it's still really the the best of all possible worlds and best of all possible times. And I also don't really we live in such an agentic era, and so much is in individuals' hands. And, the kind of to extend the metaphor of universal suffrage to every area of life, that feeling completely passive and victimized in today's society, I always feel that there is something being missed there. And there is this person who kind of has to be shown their power because it's so unprecedented. And so, equalized across society in ways that it has never been. I'm not saying that, society is fully just and that we don't have any more problems to solve or improve upon. But to me, that's very interesting. I want to go and dive a little bit briefly into the 90s, talk about the internet, talk about hope. So here we are ending the Cold War between 1989 and 1991. The world changes. According to some, history ends. We know that's not really true, and that's not what really Hegel meant, but that's for a different podcast. But, there is suddenly everybody's hopeful. And something that many, many, many people from, at least where I'm from, never saw coming, even though they were in the middle of it, talk about being too close to it, suddenly happens, the Berlin Wall falls, Pink Floyd performs, capitalism arrives to Eastern Europe, along with astrology and party drugs. Great. What happened to finance in America? What happened to you in, say, 1991? Was it an overnight change? Was it a gradual thing? How do you remember that period? By this time, you were to like growing children, right? Like maybe even school-age children.
Yeah. So the thing to remember is that cultural lag is a real thing. So if you have the ability to just be a little bit ahead on some of your ideas, that can be a huge advantage for you if you're running a business, etc. So when I got into the stock market in 1982, everyone, my contemporaries laughed at me. They were like, "The stock market is for widows and orphans, dude. Like you are, well, you're a young fogey, man." And where
That's
was that coming?
amazing. Oh my God.
Where was that coming from? Well, it was coming from the worst decade for stock prices, the 1970s, and until we beat it with the decade 2000 to 2009 on a real adjusted basis. But you had all of the piling on. You had Business Week with the famous cover called "The Death of Equities," and everyone believed that stocks were for losers, widows and orphans, right? And I saw the world differently, and I'm like, oh, well, I kind of enjoy this, and I think it'll be interesting. But honestly, it wasn't until kind of the mid 90s, after like this amazing run in the stock market, that people started getting really into the stock market, right? Like, but before then, and it slowly increased the interest in it. The crash of 87, like, told you the whole thing's rigged, and we're going to have another depression. And it's like everyone makes most of their prognostications looking in the rear view mirror. And so about the mid 90s, that's when oh, this is like a real thing. Look at what the stock market has done. And people started getting really, really interested in it. And you started like a mania, which, of course, happened concurrent with the development of the internet and dot coms. And boy, talk about something that really got imaginations going. And the thing that's hard to understand, the thing that's hard to convey to somebody who wasn't there, is that everybody was affected. I'll give you an example. In 1999, I wrote a blog post called The Internet Contrarian. And in that, April of 1999, well ahead of the collapse of the dot coms, and in it, I explained why it was the biggest bubble any of us had ever seen. 85% of the companies were going to be carried out feet first. And even the ones that won would probably go down by like 90% in price. The amount of hate email I got, and email was relatively new too. Like literally, you're an
Timo
idiot.
Shaughnessy was the first person in the history of emails to get hate mail.
But here's the thing. This is how overwhelmed everyone, including me, was by the zeitgeist. What did I do after writing that in April? In September, I started an internet company.
You
And so
overrode the wise animal.
and but here's the thing. It was so pervasive and it had so captured everyone's mental real estate that you believed like the Queen in Alice in Wonderland. You could believe 18 impossible things before breakfast. And like everybody, including me, like fell for the bullshit. Like, oh, revenues, they don't matter anymore. The worst thing that could happen to an internet company was for it to have revenues because then people could price it appropriately. I mean, it was nuts. And so you the overstory, right? In the sense of the thing that is affecting everyone and everyone's thinking about everything is a real thing. And you believe at your own peril that you are unaffected by it. In hindsight, of course, I saw, well, that was pretty dumb of me. I'm very proud of the company I founded. It was called Netfolio, and it was the first, I got a patent on the origination and distribution of a stock portfolio over a worldwide computer network. The fact that I got that patent is insane. Like,
I love it.
like it's insane though. And so but the tech wasn't right. I think it was a great idea. It ultimately came to fruition for O'Shaughnessy Asset Management with
Sure.
Canvas, right?
Yeah.
But we needed 18 years to build the real technology for that kind of engine. But the mania And it's like it's hard to come up with comparisons, right?
Yeah.
You have to go all the way back to Newton losing a fortune in the South Sea trading scandal, like
Like
or bubble.
messianistic cults in like the late 1600s or something.
But like, they wrote poems about that company. Like one went, fill the South Sea goblet full, the gods shall of our stock take care. Europa pleased accepts the bull, and Jove with joy puts off the bear. Now I'm a quant, Anna, but here's an intuition for you. Sell whenever people start writing poems about a stock you might own because it
Like by
leads
the
to
time the New York Times writes about you, you're over. Yeah.
right.
I don't know if I'm sure you read the new Bern Hobart, Tobias Huber book. Bern Hobart is a good friend. He just did a wonderful intern salon in Austin with a mathematician, Matthias Leonardus, and the book Boom deals with financial markets kind of through the lens of innovation. And he uses a lot of, I mean, the kind of the different mania models of Soros and, for instance, Peter Thiel, and kind of Popperian versus Girardian worldview opposition. It's really, really interesting. And I do feel that, Morgan Housel is a friend to both of us. And, he writes a lot about how basically financial trauma or any kind of trauma is a terrible recipe for the future. And that we should, there is a role in life for trauma, that it can be generative and constructive and protective and, creating more empathy and care. And there are all sorts of good things coming from past suffering, but it's a terrible way to be ready for the future. And there is a beauty to overcoming whatever happened to somebody during the Great Depression or during the, I don't know, Cuban Missile Crisis. Like those are not going to be helping you later on, either because you will be deeply rejecting it and you will be over optimistic about something, like finally shake off the shackles, or you will be restricted by the fear that comes from that. To kind of go beyond the 90s. So we see the dot-com boom kind of burst and unfold. But then America has this other great trauma, right? We enter the 2000s with the cataclysm of 9/11. I always find that, I mean, I definitely, that was my youth. So I went to university in 2002 and just in time for really good indie music and terrible fashion. So I kind of like the two things coincided. I think we could safely say that like the year 2001 was horrible for fashion, for instance, unless you were like very fancy Manhattanite. So that was definitely my youth, the kind of swan songs of MTV and a really, really bad kind of excess. And I'm sure we can do an aesthetic podcast episode about that. But what was going on in the industry at the time? So we're getting through this time that actually tested out of the box thinking. So for instance, yourself, you saw it coming, other people didn't see it coming. It was a kind of moment of reckoning for everybody. And before the financial markets could have recovered and some kind of normalcy would have resettled, you have this geopolitical fallout. How do you remember that time? Like, what was that like?
So the internet .com bubble had burst. Strategies that we had found worked very well over long periods of time in many market cycles were in the driver's seat. So value strategies came back very strongly. Small cap strategies came back very strongly. So oddly, we were doing extremely well in terms of the portfolio performance. But the thing about 9/11, and by the way, talk about the fates being kind to me. I was meant to be at the World Trade Center on 9/11.
No
And
kidding, really?
oh yeah. Yeah, I was meant to be at a meeting at Morgan Stanley at 9 a.m. on
Oh my
September
God.
11, 2001, and it got changed like a couple of days before.
Oh my,
And
oh my
so
God.
my wife,
Do you know which floor and which tower? Do you remember?
yeah, I think I would have made it because my wife jokes, Jim, when the first plane hit the first tower, you would have been ignoring everyone telling you to stay in place. You would have walked down, run down the stairs, and been in Midtown by that time, by the time the second plane hit. But
I always think that the
yeah.
best way to avoid terrorist attacks is just to not be anywhere at 9 a.m. Like, don't be on the subway, don't be in a bus, don't be in office, be at home, go through your email, mind your own business, and just don't go to, like, just don't be anywhere. That's, I live my life. Like, do you think I'm anywhere?
I love that heuristic. It's
I'm
great.
nowhere at 9 a.m.
I would
Come and
totally
get
see
me.
you
I'm
and be
nowhere
at
at
that
9 a.m.
meeting, but like I got to avoid the terrorist attacks and it's 9 a.m., so I can't do it.
Always at 9 a.m. or a
But
concert late at night, which is a
but
different,
what
but like, yeah,
but what was actually interesting was I had never seen America more united in my life.
that's what people say.
And I went down and volunteered at Ground Zero with a group of friends and literally I especially for New York, like people were being so kind to one another. And it was really kind of a magical thing to see everybody, just no matter where they came from, no matter what their views on anything, like America was more united at that particular time. I suspect that it's what it felt like after the attack on Pearl Harbor, because America is, by definition, lots of different belief systems, lots of different types of people in it. But when those types of traumatic events happen, what actually happens is you see the best in people come out. And that's what I saw at least. And
And
but
the most
then
heroic, right? Like, how many people tell you that they enlisted in the army, right? Like,
yeah,
they would do things that they never thought themselves capable of doing.
yeah. And so, it also was like, again, thank God for my journals. Like I was pretty pissed about the Patriot Act, because, it was highly unconstitutional. And yet, like, if you are in that type of situation, talk about conformity, right? Like there were a lot of people saying, just a minute. I do have a point about the Patriot Act and, the Constitution that we all swore allegiance to. They were shut up really, really quickly. And so during those kinds of times, people tend to shut up.
Like the hand sanitizer during COVID, like we can't turn back time, we can't really fix it, but let's just like kill your skin.
Exactly.
Not do anything, but on during the 2 seconds that you're doing it, you will feel better about yourself.
Yeah, well, and that, what kind of grew out of that, now we're going into more recent times, but what happened that I think was not such a great thing is things just became much more performative, right? Like me saying, I'm against or I'm in favor of this should not make me feel like I've done a fucking thing about that particular thing. But it makes a lot of people think I did my part. No, you didn't. You tweeted something.
I joined
Come
the
on.
conversation. Thank you so much. The conversation did not have enough people in it yet.
I'm in the conversation. Don't you understand? Like, again, back to what I said about loving that Jung line. You are what you do. You are not what you say you will do.
I live by that. Yeah, talk
As
is
do
cheap.
I.
Talk is cheap.
I'm getting the hook here because it is
Okay.
1 o'clock. I can't believe that we
Can
started
I,
at
can I
11
have a
minutes
last
one.
question? Can I have a last
Sure.
question? You have
Absolutely.
3 minutes to answer this. Okay.
Yes.
The last question. When did the current era start? We went through your childhood, we went through the 80s, 90s, the oaths, we talked about the financial crisis, we talked about the future a little bit, and also how we're both kind of convinced that this is the best time to be alive ever. When did this best time start? What was an emblematic event that you think kicked off this current era?
Wow, that's a great question because, eras are not uniform and polite about minding the calendar, right? Like so the aughts probably extended into like 2000, I don't know,
That's
14,
why I don't like New Year's Eve. Like, do you think
right?
that the calendar cares? No.
Forced frivolity and like I don't do resolutions or any of that kind of stuff
I
because
like the
it's
kind of like the astronomical seasons, like yeah, spring starts, etc., etc.
right,
But like first
right.
of January.
So the current era probably started in earnest maybe 2015 and kind of like it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. And
My favorite
so
line in the whole world.
yeah. And that's where I really started. That's where I started getting the idea for what has become the Great Reshuffle thesis. Like I was noticing like all of the old playbooks were not working so well. And I was very interested in that. All of the bullshit corporate speak and all that. I noticed people like just kind of laughing at people.
Yeah.
It's like that's why I love the World Economic Forum. They are so tone deaf and so kind of 1950s in their attempts at persuasion that it's hysterical. It's hysterical. And
The
they on
parody
it, I
is a
mean,
self-parody, and they
yeah,
don't.
they are a self-parody, right? And
We
it's
are
like,
not laughing with you.
no, we are laughing at you. And I started noticing that becoming a thing, right? I started noticing more and more people just calling bullshit. Just like, that's bullshit. No, I'm not buying into that. And then it's kind of created where we are now. And I since the general thesis of your podcast is hope, remember Pandora's box, right? Out of Pandora's box flew all of these awful things, but what was at the bottom of the box? Hope. And so I I think all of us are winners of the cosmic lottery. Think about that. Think about how dangerous it was to be a human being, even just a short period of time ago. Think of all of the opportunities. It no longer matters where you live. Time, space, and geography have collapsed, and you can collaborate anywhere in the world. Now, does that mean I don't think you need to seek out great cities? I think you do. I think it's great to have those people together in reality, right? But it's no longer the only way. It's a way, which I highly like and recommend, but it's not the only way. I think it's a great time to be alive.
Beautiful, beautiful place to end our podcast. Jim, this has been such a pleasure. I think we could probably talk for 17 more hours.
Easily.
It's like getting started. I hope that you will come back on the Hope Access. I think more people should be talking more openly about what drives them to
Mm.
create, and not just how we create or what we're trying to create, but this kind of core curiosity, core rebelliousness that I always find kind of in the center of the most interesting people's worldviews. So thank you so much for your generosity and for being here. And everybody who has been listening, watching, thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me. And anything for you, Anna.
Thank you.